When I turned 21, I thought adulthood would finally mean freedom. I had just finished college, landed my first real job at a local marketing firm, and was saving up for my own apartment. But life, as usual, had other plans. My dad had remarried 2 years earlier to a woman named Vanessa. She was in her mid-30s, glamorous, and always seemed to be posing for an invisible camera. From the outside, people thought she was some kind of blessing to my father, a fresh start after years of raising me alone. But inside our home, she was a parasite wrapped in designer clothing. Vanessa never worked a day since she married my dad. She claimed she was starting her own business, something about image consulting that never materialized. She'd spend hours scrolling through beauty influencer pages, ordering expensive skincare kits, or setting up photo shoots for herself that no one asked for. My dad, blinded by her charm, paid for everything. Meanwhile, I tried to stay out of it, focusing on my savings and my goal of moving out. I kept my money separate, stored safely in a joint savings account my dad had opened years ago when I was in high school. It was meant for my future: a car, a house, whatever I needed. He had access to it too, but he promised never to touch it. Everything seemed stable until one afternoon, I logged into my account and noticed something was wrong. My balance was $2,000 short. At first, I thought it was some kind of banking error, maybe a pending transaction. But when I checked the withdrawal history, my stomach dropped. The money had been transferred to a local beauty salon, one Vanessa had recently been raving about. I immediately confronted my dad. He looked confused at first, then his expression shifted into that uncomfortable mix of guilt and resignation I'd seen before. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Amy, Vanessa had a big event coming up and she needed a few treatments. She said she'd pay it back." My jaw nearly hit the floor. "Dad, that's my money," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You can't just let her take it." He tried to calm me down, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that Vanessa thought the account was shared household funds. That was a lie. She knew perfectly well that it was mine. I had mentioned my savings several times, even showed her how hard I was working to build it up. That evening, when she came home, she acted as if nothing happened. She looked radiant, freshly styled, smelling like expensive perfume, her nails manicured perfectly. She thanked my dad for being so understanding and winked at me like I was part of some joke. That smirk burned into my brain. I wanted to scream, but I realized something: losing my temper wouldn't solve anything. Vanessa thrived on drama, and my dad always took her side whenever tension arose. So instead, I smiled back and said nothing. But inside, a plan started forming. The next few days were brutal. I couldn't focus at work. I felt violated, betrayed not just by Vanessa but by my father too. I couldn't believe he would allow this. My friends told me to let it go, that $2,000 wasn't worth breaking family ties. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about respect. If I let this go, it would happen again. And again. I knew I had to make both of them understand what it felt like to be used. So, I started observing. I noticed Vanessa had developed a new obsession: her beauty business. She had started posting about becoming a licensed esthetician and offering exclusive services from home. Except she had no license, no training, nothing but a handful of overpriced creams and gadgets she didn't know how to use. I also noticed my dad had been bragging to his friends about helping her launch her dream. He'd been investing even more money buying equipment, paying for promotional ads, even turning the guest room into a mini spa. My old room, the one I'd slept in since I was a kid, thought it was sickening. But it gave me an idea. If she wanted to play businesswoman, maybe I could use that against her. I started digging. I checked her social media, her online orders, her business registration. There was none. She was using my dad's name on everything, claiming to be Vanessa Grant Beauty. That meant legally. Any shady thing she did would trace back to him. Interesting. I also knew she had an upcoming appointment with a popular local influencer she was desperate to impress. Vanessa was counting on this event to launch her brand, so I decided to hit her where it hurt most: her reputation. But before doing anything rash, I needed more proof. I quietly transferred the remaining money from that shared account into a new one under my name only. Then, I began tracking Vanessa's online activities and saving screenshots. My hands shook as I watched her post story after story about her luxury services and fully booked weekends. I knew it was all fake, but the public didn't. She was building a facade, just like she always had. The day finally came when I decided to confront her, not emotionally, but strategically. I waited until she was home alone, sipping wine in her robe, scrolling through her phone. I asked her directly if she planned to return the money she took. She laughed, not even pretending to feel guilty. "Sweetheart," she said, "consider it an investment. You'll thank me when my brand takes off." That was all I needed to hear. I went back to my room, locked the door, and started my real plan. I wasn't just going to get my money back, I was going to make her regret ever crossing me and my father. He was going to see the truth about the woman he married, whether he liked it or not. I didn't know it then, but what I was about to do would change everything. Not just for Vanessa, not just for my dad, but for me too. Because revenge, once it starts, has a way of revealing who you really are. And I was about to find out just how far I was willing to go. I booked an appointment. It felt silly at first, like something out of a movie, but I told myself I was doing it for evidence, for the one thing that would make my dad stop minimizing what Vanessa had done. I created a new email address, an anonymous social profile, and called the salon posing as a nervous bride-to-be researching options. They shoved me into a Saturday slot perfect for Vanessa, who loved performing for an audience. I arrived early, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, carrying a small voice recorder hidden inside my phone case. I told myself it was for my own protection if anything went wrong. What I didn't expect was how calm I felt when the door closed behind me and I watched Vanessa through the salon's glass partition, preening under warm lights like a queen in a tiny court. She was all soft smiles and practiced concern when she came over to consult me. She asked detailed questions about my skin, suggested 3 packages, and with each suggestion, she used phrases she'd used in her Instagram posts about investing in yourself and exclusivity. When she mentioned a special introductory rate and said she'd throw in an add-on, I leaned in, letting the camera roll silently on my phone. She signed up the imaginary client, typed in a credit card number from a fake form I'd prepared on my phone. And then, as casually as ordering coffee, she said, "By the way, don't worry about the payment, Dad's already covered some of my launch costs. He likes to help." It was the confession I needed. Not in those exact words, but close enough. I left the salon feeling hollow and electrified. I had what I wanted, a recording of Vanessa tying the business expenses to my father. But I also had the sharper realization that a recording alone wouldn't topple the carefully constructed illusions in that house. My dad had always been resistant to anything that painted Vanessa as a manipulator. He would call her misunderstood and me harsh. He believed in love stories with bad logic. If I wanted him to see the truth, I needed more than a recording. I needed undeniable, public proof that Vanessa's business was a scam built on other people's money and my father's blind generosity. So I widened the net. I dug through the shared accounts transactions again and cross-checked them with vendor names, receipts, and social media tags. Vanessa loved tagging local businesses when she got a service. And she loved posting glossy before and after photos with long captions about building a dream. I matched dates and amounts and saved everything screenshots. Timestamps, copies of email confirmations for classes she never actually attended. Then I did something that made my palms sweat. I filed a complaint with the state board that oversees estheticians. I wrote it in a calm, factual tone, attaching screenshots of her posts advertising services and the recording where she admitted using my father's money for launch costs. I claimed that someone without a license was offering paid cosmetic services in a residential space. It felt risky, but if a regulator came knocking, Vanessa's facade would crumble. I also submitted an anonymous tip to a popular local beauty blogger who had been flattering Vanessa on Instagram, attaching the same evidence and hinting at the truth. I watched and waited. The first blow came faster than I expected. The state board sent an inspector to the address where Vanessa had been practicing on weekends. The inspector knocked on the door, asked questions, and left a notice tacked to the salon window about an investigation into unlicensed practice. Vanessa's Instagram exploded that afternoon with dramatic stories about harassment from jealous people and vindictive competitors. She played the victim perfectly, with tearful selfies and long, poetic captions that made my stomach turn. My dad saw her posts and started to waver at first, but the next morning he sat me down and said something I didn't expect. He still doubted me. He said the notice could be a mix-up, that his wife was being targeted by people who wanted to sabotage her dream. He suggested I was being petty, that I should let them handle it. I felt my plan slipping, like sand between my fingers. Vanessa was counterattacking in public, and my dad was buying her narrative. That evening, I decided to push harder. I leaked the recording to the beauty blogger, but I did it anonymously, with a short message explaining that this woman was using family money and pretending to be an esthetician to make a quick buck. The blogger posted an innocuous-sounding expose, a cautionary piece about verifying credentials and watching for predatory practices in the wellness industry. They included a snippet of the recording, just enough to show Vanessa's casual admission without naming names. The piece went semi-viral in our town. Suddenly, other women started posting comments about odd experiences at home salons, and a few mentioned the same address. The inspector came back, this time with a camera and a citation that required a formal hearing. Vanessa went ballistic online, accusing anonymous trolls of destroying her life. She posted videos of herself crying and then, in a twist that filled me with a cold thrill, she posted a video of my father, sweet, soft-spoken, clearly heartbroken, pleading with the town's gossip mongers to stop. He defended her, said she deserved compassion, that a single mistake shouldn't ruin someone. The comments were split, but a dangerous majority still sided with Vanessa's dramatic victimhood. My father's insistence that she was misunderstood shifted public perception in her favor among people who valued romantic loyalty. For every person who questioned Vanessa, who defended her, I realized then that facts alone wouldn't be enough. People liked narratives more than evidence, and Vanessa was better at storytelling than I was. I needed to change the narrative in a way she couldn't fake. I had one more tool: money trails. I filed a formal complaint with the bank, asking for an internal audit of the joint account and any transfers leading to the salon and Vanessa's purchases. I included proof that the account was meant for my use and that withdrawals had occurred without my consent. I knew banks moved slowly, but I also knew they took unauthorized transfers seriously. The day the bank called to say they had placed a temporary hold on some suspicious transactions, Vanessa posted a triumphant video calling the whole thing a family dispute fueled by greed. She painted me as the villain, an ungrateful child trying to sabotage her stepmother's dream. That video hit my dad hard. He called me, and for the first time since the money went missing, his voice cracked. He asked me why I had gone so far, why I would involve regulators and banks. He said he trusted Vanessa and that he felt betrayed by my lack of faith in her. He said maybe I was projecting my own distrust onto their relationship. I sat in my car outside my office and listened to him, feeling rage and something else, an odd, sharp sorrow that cut deeper than anger alone. The man who had promised to protect my future looked at me like I'd become the problem. My attempt to expose one betrayal had morphed into a rupture between me and my father, and I couldn't tell whether I had just advanced my cause or wrecked any chance of reconciliation. Desperation made me reckless. I created a fake client account on a popular review site and posted a detailed review of an awful experience at Vanessa's salon: poor sanitation, untrained staff, and strangely, a bill that listed a consultation paid by family. The review was long, specific, and angry. I made sure to mention the $2,000 in a paragraph that read like a warning: be wary of people taking advantage of generous partners. The review gained traction, and a few other anonymous commenters chimed in with similar stories. Vanessa lashed out publicly, accusing the review site of bias and claiming she was being targeted by an ex. She even pointed fingers toward my father, accusing him of letting anonymous critics set the rules for what was truth. It was exhausting watching her rewrite the story. But underneath the theatrics, something was shifting. The bank's hold had started an investigation, and the state board's hearings were becoming official. The salon's bookings dropped. Vanessa's circle began to fracture when a friend, one who had stayed neutral, messaged my dad privately with concerns about financial responsibility after seeing the bank notice. The first crack in their fortress appeared small. My dad stopped answering Vanessa's texts in the middle of the night. He paused when she asked for cash, and once, in a rare moment of clarity, he asked me for the original account agreement. I gave it to him without a word. He read it, and his face changed. It wasn't the big reveal I'd hoped for. He still defended her sometimes, but it made him stop and think. It made him realize he had not been checking his own blind spots. I didn't know if it would be enough to bring him back to my side. I had opened a door, and behind it were consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. Public fights, tears, and a father who might choose the woman he loved over the child he'd raised. But I also had momentum. The state board had scheduled a hearing, the bank audit was proceeding, and Vanessa's social media armor had been dented. I felt both triumphant and hollow. I had wanted revenge, yes, but now I was also haunted by the thought that revenge was a two-way mirror. It showed me myself, and sometimes what you see isn't flattering. I kept telling myself the end justified the means. I savored every small victory while bracing for the inevitable backlash. Vanessa would not go quietly, and neither would my father. The next days would decide whether my actions would restore my stolen money and my dignity, or whether they would cost me more than I was willing to pay. I was ready to push forward, even though part of me wondered if I was becoming the very thing I despised. I learned quickly that the legal world moved like molasses and the court of public opinion moved like wildfire. After the state board scheduled the formal hearing, Vanessa hired a lawyer who specialized in reputation defense and small business regulation. He arrived at her side with tidy statements about due process and misinterpretation. And Vanessa used every tactic she had perfected over the years: performative remorse, strategic sobbing, claims about being overwhelmed and misunderstood. My father, Mark, sat in the middle like a wind-blown tree, swaying toward whichever gust looked warmest. He still loved her, or perhaps he loved the idea of saving someone. That made him unreliable as an ally. It also made him vulnerable to manipulation, which Vanessa used with a deftness that made my skin crawl. Meanwhile, the bank audit dug deeper than I expected. When the compliance officer called me to say they had found multiple withdrawals linked to salon equipment, influencer fees, and a series of luxury purchases charged to different vendors over the last 8 months, I felt a strange mix of vindication and horror. The $2,000 was not a one-off. It was part of a pattern. Someone had been siphoning money from that account repeatedly while my father either failed to notice or preferred not to. The bank placed holds and flagged accounts, and suddenly Vanessa's supposed launch looked less like a dream and more like a long con built out of small, habitual thefts masked as lifestyle investments. I thought I had her cornered, but Vanessa kept opening doors and walking through them. She posted a video dressed in white, claiming she was hurt by the allegations and that I was trying to ruin her life out of spite. She called me ungrateful and selfish, and those words landed with people who saw only two sides to the story: orphan victim and ungrateful child. That narrative threatened to erase everything I had built. In public, I became the villain in a melodrama she choreographed perfectly. Privately, she turned violent with desperation. She started showing up at my work under the guise of clearing the air, then sent me messages that read like warnings disguised as concern. She followed me once on a weekend walk and pretended it was accidental, wearing sunglasses and smiling as if we were old friends. Every interaction felt like a chess move. I knew she wanted to provoke me into making a mistake, a public outburst she could use to paint me unstable. I refused to give her that ammunition. Instead, I turned to quieter, sharper maneuvers. I began to collect paper trails that couldn't be spun away. I reached out to the landlord, who rented Vanessa the space she used to call a studio, and learned that the lease listed her as a tenant, under a different name, a maiden name she hadn't used since before Mark met her. That detail felt like a key. I pulled online records and found a string of business registrations and social media profiles under variations of that name. Some of them ended abruptly. One in another state had comments from angry clients and a news clipping about a consumer complaint that mentioned unlicensed cosmetic treatments. The old patterns were there, faint but unmistakable. I printed everything and put it into a neat folder I called the portfolio. It seemed ridiculously formal, but it helped me feel less like a person spiraling into vengeance and more like someone documenting a case. What surprised me most was how many small betrayals stacked up into something monstrous. Friends of Vanessa who had quietly supported her stopped answering calls when I reached out with questions. Several locals mentioned that Vanessa had a habit of borrowing money from people and never repaying it, always with some excuse about being between launches. A former neighbor emailed me a photo of Vanessa packing expensive equipment into a U-Haul at 2 in the morning. Her face determined and tired, the sort of photo that suggested moving on rather than building something new. My father, for all his faults, began to show cracks. He sat on the couch one night, a document in his hands, and for the first time looked like someone who had been used more than loved. He admitted that he had signed checks and covered charges without reading the statements, that he had trusted Vanessa to steer their shared life in sensible directions. He said he had been afraid to look too closely because confronting the truth would mean confronting his own weakness. That confession felt like a small victory. It also came with the sting of responsibility. I had broken the spell of denial, but breaking spells makes people fall, and people fall hard. Vanessa noticed the change. Her social media began to show cracks to less curated photos, more defensive captions. She hired a PR consultant who advised damage control, but that consultant was the same person who later ghosted her after receiving one too many panicked calls. In private messages Vanessa sent to mutual acquaintances, the tone shifted from coquettish to frantic. She began to threaten legal action, hinting at defamation suits and emotional damages. Threats are cheap until a lawyer draws them up, and then they cost time and money. She wanted to make me pay in both. I kept my focus on the hearing and on getting my money back. I sat down with the bank officer and the state investigator and mapped out a timeline of transactions. I prepared a statement that outlined every withdrawal, every vendor, every suspicious charge. I notified the beauty blogger that I had more documentation, and she told me she was scheduling a deeper piece. Things felt like they were tipping in my favor, until they didn't. A week before the hearing, Vanessa produced a document of her own, a certificate from a course she claimed to have completed, stamped and signed by a school in another county. She posted a photo of the certificate with a 3-paragraph post about perseverance and how false accusations were part of growth. The certificate looked real at first glance. Then a friend of mine who knew licensing procedures pointed out inconsistencies, wrong formatting, missing license numbers, fonts that didn't match official documents. It felt like fighting fire with sloppily made gasoline. I hired a private investigator with the little savings I had left, because sometimes the only way to break a crafted persona is to have someone else look where you cannot. The PI uncovered a string of small details Vanessa had missed: an old email with a bank receipt for a deposit to a mail forwarding service under that maiden name, a voicemail left on a public line from someone who referred to her by a different nickname, and a contractor invoice that listed work done for VG at a mailbox address in a neighboring county. Every lead threaded back to the same pattern: movement, quick setups, and abrupt disappearances. The investigator also found something neither Vanessa nor my father expected: a bank account used to launder small sums through third-party vendors, an account that funneled money into ads, influencer payouts, and purchases for glossy product packaging. The amounts were small and insidious, easily dismissed as marketing costs if you didn't look at them all together. But together, they painted a picture of someone building an illusion on borrowed money. I thought that would be the final blow. But Vanessa's next move was audacious. She filed a temporary restraining order against me, claiming harassment and emotional distress. The order shocked me because I had been careful to avoid direct contact, but she painted a narrative of stalking that the judge initially took seriously enough to issue a short-term injunction. For 48 hours, I could not contact Mark, could not go near the salon address, and I had to remove certain posts from social media. It felt like a legal gag. Vanessa celebrated online, calling it proof that her claims were true. My father wept and begged for calm. The restraining order bought her a window to rebuild her story. It also humiliated me in the public eye. I felt cornered, but I was not ready to surrender. The investigator tipped me off about one more lead: a former client who had been paid in gift cards and cash rather than refunds, who lived 2 hours away and had kept receipts. I drove overnight to meet her at a diner under the cover of rain. Her name was Rosa, and she had a slow, weary way of smiling that suggested she had been burnt many times by people who promised salvation. Rosa handed me an envelope of receipts and texts where Vanessa openly negotiated prices and agreed to use family funds for upfront costs. She also mentioned a detail that would change everything. Vanessa had once told Rosa, in a moment of drunken honesty, that people were tools and relationships were currency. That sentence felt monstrous when I pictured it in my father's home. Whispered with a smile, I left the diner with the envelope and a new sense of urgency. The restraining order meant I had to be clever about how I used my evidence, but cleverness had been my ally from the start. I fed the bank and the state board the receipts, the investigator's notes, and Rose's testimony through her attorney. I kept my distance from my father but left a stack of documents in his mailbox with a note that said simply, read. That night I lay awake wondering if I had become the person who destroyed a family for a sum of money. The answer lived somewhere between righteous anger and ruthless practicality. Revenge, I reminded myself, was not about spectacle anymore. It was about accountability. The hearing would decide whether Vanessa's act was a misstep or a pattern, and whether Mark would protect the truth or wallow in delusion. I didn't know if the evidence would be enough to bring them both down, or if the cost would be greater than I could pay. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I could not stop now. The morning of the hearing arrived like a storm, with the gray sky heavy and inevitable. The courthouse smelled of coffee and paper, and people who had nothing to do with our story sat in the hall, reading court notices as if they were headlines. Vanessa walked in with a careful limp and a face polished by rehearsed suffering. Her lawyer handled his suit like armor, and my father, Mark, looked hollow-eyed, as if he had slept in a chair all night. I carried the portfolio under my arm and felt its weight like a promise. The state board prosecutor opened the session with the basics: unlicensed practice, cash payments, complaints. The bank attorney presented transaction chains and flag transfers. For a moment, everything I had done, the recordings, the investigator's notes, Rose's receipts, felt like clean tools in a well-lit room. Then Vanessa's defense shifted the floor beneath us. Her lawyer produced a thick binder and pointed to what he said were forgeries in the bank's audit. Documents that, on first glance, linked me to the anonymous reviews and showed a transfer authorization signed with my name. He claimed the bank's audit was sloppy and that someone was manipulating evidence to smear Vanessa. My pulse quickened because the signature he displayed looked eerily familiar, not mine, but similar enough that without analysis a judge might accept it. The room buzzed. Whispers threaded through the audience like a current. I watched Mark's face fold as if someone had pressed their thumbs into it. The defense then played a short clip, edited and clipped like a trailer, that framed me as the aggressor, a voice, allegedly mine, making angry threats. The prosecutor's eyebrows lowered. Vanessa's lawyer smiled in that cold way some people reserve for finishing a game. I felt the floor tilt. All my careful anonymity, my fake client calls, my anonymous posts, everything could be reframed as a vendetta, not accountability. I remembered the restraining order and how it had already shifted sympathy toward Vanessa. Now the hearing threatened to turn the tide entirely. I felt panic like a metallic taste and then something steadier: clarity. The investigator's work had given me more than receipts. It had given me metadata. I asked the judge for a short recess to consult my attorney and the pie. The judge granted it with a skeptical look, and outside the courtroom I found the pie with an exhausted smile and a laptop. He had worked through the night analyzing the audio and the supposed signed authorization. He pointed to waveforms that had been spliced, to file creation times that didn't match the dates the defense claimed, to EXIF data on images that showed a different camera and a different timestamp. The signature the defense relied on had been scanned and manipulated from a contract Vanessa had signed years earlier under her maiden name. Someone had overlaid it onto a bank form. The pie had pulled server logs from the review site and matched IP paths that led to a reputation fixer's BP, and that, crucially, had been paid by a wire from an account linked to a domain registration under Vanessa's maiden name. It was dirty, clever, and traceable. We went back into the courtroom with new momentum. I watched Vanessa's calmness crack for the first time. Her lawyer tried to dismiss the metadata as technical jargon, but the prosecutor, whose job was to uphold facts, requested forensics. A court-ordered digital forensics expert was called in, and the air in the room shifted again into a crystalline focus that favored timestamps and server logs over performances and sob stories. The expert confirmed the splicing, the manipulation, and the trail that led back to the fixer's account. Then came another twist. The fixer's email contained a forwarded message from a personal address, an address that matched a recovery email tied to Vanessa's vendor accounts. It was not definitive proof of direct payment, but it was a thread. Mark sat up straighter. The judge, now watching timelines rather than theatrics, ordered a temporary hold on Vanessa's glossy narrative and asked for the bank to produce raw logs. I felt a surge of vindication, but the fight had grown teeth. Vanessa recoiled, and in private messages and posts she escalated her behavior. She began accusing me of forging the very documents I had provided, claiming I had created the evidence to ruin her. The public debate sharpened into two camps: people who wanted to believe the neat version of events Vanessa sold, and those who could see the lattice work of fraud. My father, for all his wavering, started to read more carefully. He asked questions he had never asked about vendors, purchase receipts, the seller names on invoices. He found, in a stack of printed statements I had left for him, a recurring pattern of payments to a packaging company in another state and a payment to a mail forwarding service that had been used to set up a shell address. He confronted Vanessa in a kitchen that smelled of burnt toast and coffee gone cold, and for the first time his words were not protective prayers but pointed questions. Vanessa answered with evasions until her voice rose and then cracked. Her hands trembled in a way that revealed nerves under practiced calm. She insisted she had done nothing illegal, that every payment was for marketing, and that anyone alleging otherwise wanted to destroy her. It was a performance I had watched many times, but this time the props were failing. The hearing reconvened and produced another shock. One of Vanessa's former associates, someone who had helped her with early product labels, appeared quietly in the back and unexpectedly raised his hand to speak. He was a small man with tired cheeks and a voice that didn't tremble. Under oath, he recounted being paid in cash and gift cards, of being told to ship small batches to a mailbox in a neighboring county, of being instructed to keep receipts separate. He testified to a conversation in which Vanessa said relationships were useful and people were tools. The courtroom sank into a kind of stunned silence. That testimony closed a loop because it corroborated Rose's story and the PI's discovery of the shell addresses. The judge frowned and asked for more documentation. Then came the moment that made my chest drop. Vanessa's lawyer produced a trove of character witnesses, friends, neighbors, clients who swore she was a caring, talented esthetician whose dreams had been hurt by petty accusations. Their statements were heartfelt and public. The courtroom became a place where truth and affection collided in ways that logic could not always unravel. I realized, with a cold certainty, that winning legally would not immediately translate into winning morally in the town square. The hearing was adjourned until the bank could produce raw logs and the fixer's account could be subpoenaed. The delay felt like a timeout that favored the better storyteller. I walked out into the courthouse light and found Mark waiting, his face a mask of exhaustion and something else, remorse. He handed me an envelope with his handwriting on the outside and said nothing. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I opened it. Inside were canceled checks, a ledger of his personal expenses, and a short letter in which he admitted to years of negligence, signing checks without reading them, approving charges because he hated conflict, funneling money into what he thought was a shared life, and avoiding questions because asking would mean admitting he had been wrong. He wrote that he loved Vanessa, but had ignored signs because love felt easier than truth. The confession was both a liberation and a wound. I wept for the father who had been used and for the child who had been abandoned by his own blindness. But beneath the grief was iron. The hearing would continue, but the truth was a slow machine, and now it had gears. Vanessa's options were narrowing. Discredit the evidence, discredit the witnesses, or run. In the quiet hours I imagined each path and its likely consequences. I also imagined a final twist I could not yet enact alone. What if the fixer's subpoena revealed direct payment from Vanessa's account? What if the mail forwarding address led to a storage unit with physical inventory and invoices that matched the bank's suspicious payments? The possibilities felt dangerous and intoxicating. I slept poorly, haunted by the thought that revenge had become a legal crusade that threatened to fracture my family beyond repair. The next day, a court clerk handed me a notice. The fixer's account had been traced to a shell company and a storage unit had been located. It was proof enough to reconvene the hearing sooner. My stomach turned into a knot so tight I thought I might choke on it, but underneath the fear there was a bright, focused ember of hope. Vanessa's smile had become a scar, and Mark had begun to see it. The hearing would determine more than money. It would determine if our home could be rebuilt on truth, or if it would remain a stage where empathy was weaponized. I prepared for the confrontation, knowing that whatever happened next might sever us completely or finally set things right. The day the subpoenaed storage unit was opened, I felt like I was walking into a trap I had laid for myself. Rain-slicked streets reflected neon signs and streetlights as I drove, the envelope of documents burning in my bag like a secret weapon. When I arrived, the PI was already there, his face tight with anticipation. The lock clicked, and the metal door creaked open to reveal boxes, bags, and plastic containers labeled with neat, printed tags. Each container contained the glossy packaging Vanessa had posted about, stacks of receipts, influencer invoices, and marketing materials, all purchased with my money and funneled through the shell accounts. There were notebooks with handwritten calculations, price lists, and even a calendar marking appointments with clients that never existed. It was the smoking gun I had needed. Every carefully staged post, every fabricated launch, every dollar misappropriated. I felt a chill as I flipped through the documents. This was more than money. This was the facade of a life built entirely on deceit. Back in court, the evidence was presented with a calmness I had cultivated through months of meticulous planning. Vanessa's lawyer sputtered at first, trying to argue that the storage unit contents were props or samples, but the receipts, bank transfers, and metadata left no room for ambiguity. The forensic expert confirmed that payments originated from my account and had been authorized by Vanessa without consent. The public testimony of Rosa, the former associate, and the PI's evidence all aligned to expose a pattern too consistent to dismiss. I sat quietly as Mark's face changed. He had no words at first, just that hollow pause, the weight of realization pressing down. He looked at Vanessa, whose facade of calm now cracked visibly. Her carefully curated performance had finally faltered. The judge's verdict came after what felt like hours condensed into seconds. Vanessa was found liable for misappropriating funds, practicing without a license, and submitting fraudulent documentation. The financial restitution was ordered, including the $2,000 stolen from my account and additional funds for the misuse of my father's finances. Vanessa's salon license application was permanently denied, and she was fined for unlicensed practice. The court emphasized that my father's unintentional negligence did not excuse Vanessa's manipulation. For the first time, Mark faced the truth without filtering it through love or denial. The day after the verdict, Mark called me. His voice was low, carrying both shame and relief. He apologized not just for defending Vanessa blindly, but for failing to recognize the signs and protect me, for letting someone exploit his love to hurt his own child. I listened, still cautious, still wary, but something had shifted. The walls he had built around himself began to crack. For the first time, I sensed a father who could see clearly, not through a romanticized lens. Vanessa, on the other hand, disappeared from social media for weeks, her public persona fractured. Friends stopped answering calls, her brand collapsed under scrutiny, and local influencers who had previously praised her now avoided any association. She was still alive, still walking, but the illusion of power she had constructed evaporated. I didn't feel a triumphant high, not exactly. Revenge had its own bitter aftertaste, like cold metal in your mouth. But I felt something else, clarity, a sense that I had reclaimed control over my life and finances. The $2,000 was returned, yes, but more importantly, the manipulation and lies were exposed, and my father saw the truth. Our relationship, though still tender and needing repair, had room to breathe, unshadowed by Vanessa's charm or deceit. I had done what I needed to do, not for malice, not for show, but because betrayal demanded a response. Weeks later, Mark and I began rebuilding trust. We instituted clear boundaries with finances, set rules for accountability, and started seeing a counselor together. Vanessa tried once to contact him, sending messages that were polite on the surface but laced with subtle threats. He ignored them. She realized the grip she had relied on, control over perception, manipulation of emotion, was gone. I finally moved forward, renting a small apartment of my own, where my money and my future were secure. The memory of betrayal lingered, yes, but it no longer dictated my actions. The lessons, the strategies, and the vigilance I had developed became my armor. In the end, revenge was not about hurting Vanessa or making my father suffer. It was about reclaiming dignity, exposing deceit, and ensuring that trust was respected. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, but I survived, wiser and more cautious, with the certainty that boundaries, once crossed, demand consequences. Life continued, but now, on my own terms, with clarity, control, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served.